Hey, listeners, before this week's episode, I want to take a moment and share something with you because if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know Amy Anderson. Amy's been a part of the Unstuck team for more than 10 years. She's been on this podcast. She's been in the room with a lot of your churches. She is a genuine part of what we do here. Last week, Amy experienced a brain bleed that led to a stroke. We are grateful, incredibly grateful, that her husband Jason was home with her when it happened, and that she was able to get care quickly. She is recovering, and there is already a lot to thank God about for that. Now, this week's episode was actually recorded before any of this happened. We went back and forth on whether to share it or not, but honestly, it felt right because this topic, helping church leaders discover and lean into their gifting, is something that Amy cares deeply about. It's the kind of work that just lights her up. So in a way, releasing this episode felt like the right thing to do right now. We'd love for you to join us in praying for Amy and her family every day as she continues to heal. We'll keep you updated as we're able. Thank you so much for being a part of this tribe that we call Unstuck Churches. Now, here's this week's episode of the Unstuck Church podcast. Welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast. I'm Sean, your host, here with my teammate again, Amy Anderson, and we are in week 3 of our Structured for Burnout series. Amy, back in week 1, we talked about how your structure could be setting you up for burnout. And then in week 2, we talked about the importance of getting your senior leadership team right in order to avoid burnout, quite honestly. And today we're talking about how important it is to structure around your wiring.
Yeah. And, to be clear, this doesn't mean that you build your structure around people first, because when we're talking about wiring, what's the wiring of the people around us? We still have that mantra, where we say you need to do your strategies first, then you need to build your structure, and then you need to choose the people, right? Because if you go backwards, then we have, who do we have? What can they do? What can we do?
Right.
But when you do get to the people part, I just think it's really important to understand what wiring is needed, both for that role and for the team that they're going to be a part of.
All right, we're going to get into that content, but before we do, I want to stop and say thanks to our podcast sponsor, Plain Joe Studios. Our most recent Unstuck Church report that we just went through a few weeks ago said that the average church is growing by 14% year over year. And that means that there are a lot of churches that are paying more attention to their worship space than ever. Well, the creative team at Plain Joe works with churches to create beautiful, engaging spaces that connect with their community. They have a team of architectural, design, and branding experts who help transform worship spaces into attractive, engaging hubs for that community. If that's an area that your church could use some help, reach out to them today at plainjoe.net. Yeah. So, Amy, there's a tool, honestly, we've used on our team for several years now, and it's called the Working Genius. And today we get to have Cody Thompson, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Table Group, join us on the podcast. He's one of the geniuses behind the Working Genius to kind of introduce that tool. And I know there are a lot of churches that are using this, but for churches that aren't, they need to be considering it. And for everyone, we're going to go in depth in some of the ways that Working Genius can help our churches avoid burnout, right?
Yeah, so let's jump into our conversation with Cody.
So today we're excited to have Cody Thompson on the podcast. Cody is the Chief Operating Officer at the Table Group.
And I'm guessing, Sean, that many of our listeners are familiar with the Table Group because when I'm on the ground with churches, I'll do like a show of hands. How many are familiar with Working Genius or many of the other resources from the Table Group, which, by the way, was super foundational in my leadership development over the years. I've always appreciated and passed on those resources. So, Cody, it is great to have you with us. And, I was just thinking, I think I was in the very first group of facilitators that you all trained on Working Genius. And now I have facilitated that assessment with so many churches. And you know this, but it is just extremely helpful with the churches, church teams that are out there. It's light bulb moments for what's missing on their team. So that's why I am so glad to have you on the call today to share it with our broader audience. But just in case someone is not familiar with the Table Group, maybe not familiar with Working Genius, can you just tell us a little about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Amy, if you were in the first training, that means I ran it. It's gotten much better since then. So if anybody is interested, we have far more competent people running that now than we did in the first few times. But yeah, Working Genius has been, I think it's been out for about 4.5 years now. So we, it's like many things Pat has done. I kind of describe Pat as like an excavator, what are the people that you unearth dinosaur bones or whatever. He just kind of brushes the dirt off of things that are true, and people kind of experience like the universal truths that he observes. So it was actually born out of a frustration we had on our own team. Pat was loved parts of his job and was really grumpy at other parts of his job, and somebody asked him the question, "Why are you like that?" And so he went to a whiteboard and kind of tried to dissect what we do at work. And we came out with these 6 circles that were all of the 6 activities that we thought kind of comprised any activity, or any like job, or any type of work, whether you're like launching a product or running a church or a business. And so we were using it internally for months and months. And then one of our consultants came in, looked at the whiteboard, and we kind of explained what was on the whiteboard. And the next day he used it with a CEO that he was with. And the CEO actually got tears in his eyes, and he's like, this explains a lot of what I'm feeling on my team. Wow. So it wasn't like we weren't sitting in a room thinking the world needed another assessment, because we all know that's not true. Like, we've been told we're red dolphins and, colors and animals and all sorts of letters. So it was not that. It was really just like, hey, how do we understand what we do at work, and how do we understand how other people contribute? So quick flyover, that's probably where we should start, right? Like, what are the Working Genius and what are the activities? So I'll try to be concise. So there are 6 things that make up any type of work. And Working Genius is really this concept that all of us are innately wired by God to enjoy 2 of them, to get joy and fulfillment from 2 of them. We call that your Working Genius. And then there's 2. So as I'm explaining this, it's helpful for listeners to kind of think like, okay, 2 of these might resonate with me as something I get joy and energy from. 2 of them will be something that really drain you or frustrate you. We call those your working frustrations. 2 in the middle are kind of like what we call your working competencies. I like to use the analogy like your Working Genius is like riding a bike downhill. You could do that all day long. You don't really have to think about it. Working frustrations, on the other hand, is like riding a bike uphill. If you do that for any amount of time, it's going to really drain you pretty quickly. And then working competencies, you can do it for a little while. It's like riding on a flat surface. So as we're going through these, you can kind of self opt into like, oh, that's the type of thing that I love and enjoy and get a lot of energy from. So here's the idea, is that work happens in these 6 activities, typically in this order, which is the first one is wonder. And so when we talk about wonder, we're talking about these are people who love, pondering the bigger picture. It's not like their heads are in a cloud in a not practical way, but they're really wondering and like pondering like the bigger picture. What is missed opportunity, potential? They ask great questions, and they're always sort of helping us understand like what problem are we actually trying to solve, And that should be the start of any initiative that we take on. Should start with, what problem are we trying to solve? And then it goes to the next genius, or the next Working Genius, which is the gift of invention. And so invention, they respond to the question of the wonder, like, what is the opportunity here? What can we do more of? Or what do our customers want from us, or our constituents, like whether you're serving customers or people in pews or whatever you're doing. And the inventor loves the freedom to come up with new creative ideas around that. They like kind of imagine like a blank whiteboard. Like, I love the idea. An inventor would look at a blank whiteboard and a question and say, I can't wait to come up with a lot of ideas around that.
Clearly that is not my genius, Sean. I don't like blank whiteboards. Draw something on it and then I can get to work.
But we'll get to your genius, though.
Okay.
We will.
We'll get there. Well, and I mentioned the origin story. So Pat is an inventor. Somebody asked him the question, why are you like this? Like, why are you frustrated at parts of your job? He literally went to a blank whiteboard and said, I don't know, let's play around with that. So that's like the gift of invention, right? Then after invention comes discernment. So there are people that are uniquely wired to have good gut feel, judgment, like evaluating the invention. So the inventor kind of presents these ideas, and someone with discernment will be able to pick like, oh, that's the one that we should pursue. Or, hey, maybe I like that one, but let's tweak it this way. So they sort of vet and refine the ideas from the inventor. So that's the next activity in work. Every invention should be discerned before we move forward with it. Mm-hmm. And then it moves to the next genius, which is galvanizing. So this is the one where people love rallying the troops around that idea. You can call it like, I like to think of galvanizing as part inspiration. We might like inspire people to act around that idea. Or it is, sometimes you can do it by like pushing people out of their comfort zone. Like, hey, I know we really need to get behind this. So it's like creating the first amount of like energy and momentum around the discerned idea, right? So they're like being in front of rooms, galvanizing the team towards action and pushing them out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, and we find on those teams, that's a lot of our campus pastors, teaching pastors. They often have that galvanizing gift, which is, fits with their role very well because they're trying to envision their congregations.
And that's also you, Amy. Now we found your genius.
There it is.
Right.
Yeah. No whiteboard. Just let me talk.
That's right. That's awesome. Okay, so there's two more. I know you said brief, and I'm bad at that.
No, this is good.
No, this is good.
I'll try to go a little faster. So galvanizing, let's rally the troops. Let's get everybody, the energy and momentum focused around that idea. The next genius is the genius of enablement. And we actually like wrestled with this word quite a bit. It's like, what is it that when someone possesses this, that they are really uniquely gifted at like supporting ideas, getting them off the ground, like the initial movement around responding to the galvanizer and saying like, I'm here to help. And we use the word enablement, like we thought of a bunch of other words. Obviously there's like some negative connotation with that word, but when you are doing that in light of working genius, these are like the team players that are the glue on a team. They want to bring everybody along with them. They're willing to support the idea, get the initial momentum going. Oftentimes they can like volunteer too much for things. They so much want to please others that they can say like, I'll help, like all the time in every aspect of whether you're, at a church setting or in work. So they're, but they really are uniquely gifted at the people part of the idea and like really bringing everybody along, right? If you lack this, which I think Sean and I both have enablement as a frustration, we don't even really think about like, how do we get everybody on, bring everybody along with the idea, or how do we, sometimes I'm like, I'm willing to help you, but I want to help you with my discernment, not just my support.
I actually think so that's my other genius. I think that's actually how I got my job because Tony had all of these things that he wanted to get moving. And that was my natural come alongside and let's go. Let's make it happen.
Yeah.
So
they really are. I mean, we have so many people with enablement on our team. They help like grease the gears of teamwork for our entire organization. It's really beautiful genius to have. Yep. So the last one is called tenacity. So where people with enablement, they like to they're more people focused in terms of implementation. Tenacity are very task focused. Like they want to see for me, I'm fine seeing the finish line. People with tenacity are like, we're going to go all the way. We're going to get in the end zone. Like we're not, they're great at like pushing initiatives all the way through to completion. So they actually really love clarity, details about what the expectations are and when we want to finish this. And they won't let you move on to the next task until we've completed that task. So all the way from wonder, like what question or what problem are we trying to solve, through invention, tenacity people are like, we're not moving on until we see the results of that in our team, our organization, or, like we're going to make sure this thing gets finished.
Now, and so that's an acrostic for widget. So that's how I can remember those 6 geniuses. Right. Thanks for giving us that overview. By the way, if you're listening today and this is a brand new content for you, I recommend pick up the book, start listening to the podcast, because what we're going to get into next is really talking about how these geniuses fit in on a team and how you can help not only yourself, for sure yourself, know your geniuses and get your job in the right shape, but it's how you also have the team around you. So as we look at these geniuses, Cody, what are some of the most common ways leaders end up doing work like outside their genius and not even realizing it? You talked a little bit about how Pat was like that, but what ways can they see that?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that we are all like we say this often. Every job is a 6-letter job, so all 6 letters are kind of required in every job. But we don't often think about, well, what's the order of those letters for my job? Like, how do I, and sometimes in certain environments, certain activities of work are more rewarded than others. So we sometimes get like thrust into, and I think the real answer to your question is we've done a bad job as leaders and managers of really articulating what the work is when we hire people. So we do a job description and we try to match a resume and say, do you have 4 years of experience being this job description, or this title? And we think that a job is a job is a job, and that's not true. Or a pastor is a pastor is a pastor. That's not true either.
That's right.
And then there's, I think that oftentimes, we talk about an imposter syndrome. Like people think like, oh, I don't belong here. I think there's also like an impersonator syndrome where you look at somebody who's doing this well and you think, I have to do it just like them, And so I'm going to try to mimic who they are in that role because they're successful without a real understanding of who I am and how God wired me. And so I think that there's a combination of ways that people sort of wake up and find themselves like really drained because they're in a role or a job that doesn't really fit their geniuses, partly because they don't know what they are. And then partly because they're sort of thrust into these positions and say, here's the gamut of responsibilities that you have, just go and do them.
Yeah, I've seen that a little bit with some senior pastor succession where you've had this, 24, 25 years, you've had this lead pastor, and then the new person comes in. They probably don't have the same geniuses. They have some of the same competencies, like as far as the gifts that you need to be a lead pastor at a church. But I could see where that successor could be working outside their genius for some time without even realizing it.
Cody, some of the language that you guys have developed around this has been really helpful for me. I mean, this is called the working genius, but some of the other words that you use, the competencies and the frustration, have helped me a lot because there are some things that I do that I wonder, maybe similar to what Pat was experiencing, why do I feel the way I do as I do this? Why does this kind of make me angry in some ways? And so just being able to put that word to it, frustration, it's not that I can't do it. It explains how I feel when I do it. So I wonder, from your perspective, what are some of those telltale signs that somebody is in the wrong role, that they're kind of working in those frustrations maybe? How can you tell that wiring is a mismatch there and maybe not just burnout or overload?
Yeah. So it's really important to remember that what working genius, the assessment, what that assessment is about joy and energy. It's not really about your ability to do some of those things. Like I remember we first put this assessment out and I had someone who like a really, really intelligent, had gone through medical school, said, hey, I took your assessment and it told me that I wasn't good at tenacity. I went all the way through medical school. How is that possible? And I was like, well, did you like it? And she's like, no, it was terrible. And I was like, oh yeah. That's okay. I mean, you can get through that, but this is about what measures what fills you up. Like, I actually think one of the really unique things about working genius is when you do things in your working genius, it's like charging your battery. It's not just like, oh, I can do it. It's the thing that you start doing that you're like I'll wake up at 6 a.m. and galvanize. Like that feels like a blast. But if I have to wake up at 6 a.m. and start with tenacity, which is one of my frustrations, and I feel all sorts of like discouragement, frustration, and ultimately, I think when your question is like, how can someone identify that? We're often in roles where burnout is one of the ways that I think we're moving in that direction towards burnout. Is like, I think this is like a burnout finder assessment as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think people very often, this was one of my ahas when we first started this process, was I think people have often thought of burnout, or the way we typically think of it is the amount of work that you have. Oh, I'm overloaded.
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's more about the type of work that you're doing than the amount of work, which is a very liberating idea.
It sure is, Cody. It's brilliant.
Because you can do very little work in your frustration and get burned out. And you can do tons of work in your genius and feel totally fulfilled. And so just the idea that people could have a lens where they could say like, well, what is the thing that gives me joy and energy? And what's the thing that I'm frustrated by is just a great first step to understanding burnout and how God wired you, you know?
Yeah.
That is really good.
It's really funny. We just did the Unstuck Church report. I don't know what Working Geniuses is, but I had the honor of evaluating all of the submissions that came in. And my husband and I were on vacation, and we're in our hotel, and we're like, let's get a couple hours of work done. And he is just kind of staring at me because I'm in this spreadsheet, just living the dream. I love analysis. And he's looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, I could do this all day. Right. But again, going back to when I stepped into more content for the podcast, when I would have that blank, just outline script, just like intro, this, that, I could sit there forever and not hardly get a thing done until my good friend Tiffany on our team said, why don't I put a few words in there first, and then I could take it from there. But it's exactly what you said. I could work forever on the things that bring me energy. So that really is the difference, right? When you're evaluating your work, how do you feel? As Sean said, does it create energy and joy, or does it create frustration, really?
Yeah. And the beautiful thing is, I mean, God made us to need each other. We only have two of the working geniuses in our, so even imagine like in your marriage, there's 6 working geniuses. The maximum you and your partner can have are 4.
Yeah.
And we've had so many people reach out and say, man, we've had this 15-year fight in our marriage because we didn't understand how each of us are wired. You know, like I had a mom, this was like one of my favorite stories. A husband and wife reached out and they said, we've had this mom felt guilt and shame her entire life because she would do most of the laundry. And then when it came time to fold and put it in the kids' rooms, she would put it on a bed in the guest bedroom. And the kids would like go in there and pull socks out, and it's all clean laundry. And she's like, I felt all this guilt and shame around this. And then she's like, and then I realized I don't have tenacity. I don't like the very end of the project. Yeah. And her husband had obviously like contributed to the guilt that she had felt. So they both emailed in and they were like, now we have a laundry service.
There you go.
What a beautiful thing. They were like, we had this fight for no reason other than we didn't understand how God wired her. And now we do. It's beautiful.
Cody, there are a lot of pastors listening today. And for a leader that's watching their team right now, what patterns show up when somebody is consistently working outside of that genius? And then when they do that, how is that related to the idea of burnout and experiencing burnout?
Sure. So I think there's 2 ways to think about this. If you're evaluating your team, any project should go through all 6 of those activities, right?
Yeah.
When you look at a team map, so you can like take Working Genius with your team, you can put it on a team map, and we do this with clients all the time, and it looks like you've been a part of their last 20 team meetings because you can start to predict things about their team based on their wirings. And so if you're a pastor leading a team, if there's a really common area where you're getting stuck, like, the unstuck group, if you're getting stuck or lost or bored or frustrated, or you're spending a lot of time, because we love our working genius, teams that have lots of discernment love taking tons of time to evaluate an idea. So we might just like spend a bunch of time there. Like, why do we never actually execute on this idea? We can start to see patterns in our team because we don't have anybody with enablement and tenacity to like execute the idea, So if you're looking at so that's the way you would maybe look at it with a team, hey, where are we getting stuck or lost or bored or frustrated, drained? Like there are teams that, I worked with a church board. They beautiful team, like wonder, invention, discernment, like really, really thoughtful about the content that they were putting out.
They're just ready fire, aren't they? Ready aim. I mean, ready aim, ready aim, ready aim.
And really bad at galvanizing the whole congregation to engage with it. And really bad at externally marketing themselves because nobody wanted to stand in front and like galvanize people around that. Well, they felt some shame about us. Like that's fine. We don't need to feel shame or guilt around that. Like, let's just recognize that we're lacking a genius in that area. So for an individual, that's pretty similar too, is like, you know, I have a friend who works at a church on the East Coast, and he went in for a performance review, and he was not working in his genius. His role was not like really tied to his working genius. And he took in his working genius report and showed it to the senior pastor and said, hey, I think this is like not working for you and it's not working for me. And they changed his job, and he got like promoted to a different role because they finally understand who he was, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, after working with teams, Sean, I'm just going to jump in and answer your question too. It's basically what you're saying, but just for our listeners and their context. I think that there are some teams that really do fail to execute on things. So there's geniuses that are good at it. Yeah. There's other teams that make wrong decisions. So they're great at invention, but they're lacking those discerners, and they're starting and stopping because things just aren't working. So I think as our listeners get more familiar with it, it's a little bit easier to diagnose. You know, one of my funny stories, it was shortly after I got trained in this, and I worked with a pastor in the Northeast, and he's an Italian guy, big personality. And I'm like, oh, he's invention and galvanizing. And he was doing it down every hallway he walked. And he was the lead pastor. So you have the executive pastor with discernment going, you can't do that anymore. You can't do that. We need to discern your ideas because of position and energy and galvanizing strength. So, you know, if you have a team that they're not sure, did we make that decision? Where are we going? They're probably lacking some of that discernment area on their team.
Yeah. That's a really great insight. I think when you think of the working genius, if you skip a step, you're skipping someone's ability to, like, you're skipping a person, actually, the way God wired them. So if you move from invention to galvanizing, and somebody with discernment is like, hold on, can we evaluate that? Like, are we sure that's the right thing to do? And what's unfortunate and beautiful at the same time is that the leader kind of has the formal authority to live at their geniuses.
That's right.
You know, so oftentimes when we look at a team map, we will double the leader's weight. You know, like if you're an IG leader, that means the team probably, you know, every meeting you're in, every conversation you're in, you're going to live at the elevation of invention galvanizing in a way that people kind of have to, you know, like move in that direction, whether that's their genius or not.
I think so. You guys have talked about, Cody, some of those geniuses that are kind of the disruptors. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to let the disruptors into the conversation because they might slow things down, or they might disrupt what we think is a great idea, right? And I've seen that play out on teams as well, where if we're not really allowing each of those geniuses to show up in the development of an idea or a project, we miss those steps. And sometimes it's unfortunately intentional.
Yeah. I don't want to get too nerdy about the model, but I love that you brought that up because it is really helpful for people. So we use the gears to represent working genius, and the top gears are all responsive gears, meaning wonder, discernment, and enablement are all responsive, meaning wonder responding to the environment, discernment responding to the invention, and enablement responding to the galvanizing. And then the bottom gears are more what we call disruptive, and not disruptive in like it's more responsive disruptive. Like they're more like, you know, you could think of it inhale and exhale. You know, like, they're
not there to cause problems, right?
It's not like a bad label. It's like, inventors really disrupt things with like, I have an idea. You know, a galvanizer disrupts things by saying, come on, you guys, let's go. You know, and tenacity people are like, we're not stopping until we get to the finish line. So, so that's sort of an interesting way. And if you look at your team members, your staff, like you can tell when somebody has two responsive geniuses. They're really, really, you know, an inhale, a pause. Like I really want to evaluate that. If you're a discerner enabler, you're going to like really want to contemplate what's going on. If you're an inventor galvanizer, like you mentioned, Amy, you're like, I have an idea, let's go.
Yeah.
And so there's almost no inhale when somebody is like that.
Well, and here's the world that I get to live in, Cody. I'm surrounded by Sean and Tiffany, who are inventor discerners. So they just go in constant loops.
Yeah.
We do.
They'll start speaking. No, I'm like, just like,
it's a little bit of a curse, Cody,
there.
because I think I have a great idea, but then I figure out it's not a great idea, and then I just kind of cycle that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and inventor discerners, what's great about like you guys come up with ideas and already start refining and vetting them in your own brain. So by the time you present it to Amy, you're like, I've already thought about that. So it can sometimes come across like you're defensive about the idea, but it's really that you've just thought it through more thoroughly than people realize.
That's
so true.
Yeah.
And Cody, we obviously can't go into everything, but I'm thinking about the pastors out there in this subject of burnout. Working Genius is also so helpful for meetings and helping the team really understand where are we at in the stage of this work. So for us, for our team, when it came to Wonder, we had a couple people with competencies, but I could actually just relax now and not feel that anxiety and that feeling like I wasn't contributing. And then it's also helpful when we're in that stage, like for Jacinta on our team, who's tenacity, she also knows I can just sit for a while and then my genius will kick in at a different point. But I think that can be a source of burnout because of how it makes you feel when you don't feel competent. The other thing that I've seen a lot of with the teams is that idea of turbulence. Where, and again, depending on what your role is in the church, if you're the lead pastor, if you're the executive pastor, you're leading a ministry area, that turbulence is a real thing when we're jumping between wonder and tenacity or between invention and tenacity. And so that's been a really helpful thing too. So again, I know we can't go into it fully on this podcast to our listeners, but if this is intriguing you at all, there's so much discovery in how to build a team around you where you can really thrive in your geniuses. And actually, let me ask that. So how do you build a team with a healthy mix of strengths so that the work gets done without feeling drained? Is it a balanced approach? Like, how do you coach teams through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it takes an amazing amount of self-restraint to not go into the meeting scene, because I think you're hitting on something that so many people
I know, it's so good.
Experience.
But Cody, you guys have some great podcasts where you cover that whole topic, right?
Yeah,
a lot of our listeners could refer to those.
And Pat wrote a book, Death by Meeting, that like Working Genius gave extra light to. And so there's plenty of resources out there for people to fix their meetings. But how do you build a team around this? Like, I think that if I'm talking specifically to pastors or people that are in churches, it would be like really a disservice to them to be like, yeah, you should have a perfect mixture of all of the Working Genius on your team, because you can't necessarily hire. You can't always go farm out some of these activities to somebody else. And so the first thing is the first step for any leader is self-awareness. Who are you? How did God wire you? And who are you as a leader? If you know who you are, then you can start to understand the gifts and talents of your team, and you can tap into those gifts and talents, And so if you're building a team, if somebody comes to me and says, I want to start a business and I'm a solopreneur, I would say, well, let's do your Working Genius and I'll tell you where you're going to get burned out. So many pastors are out there like with really small staffs, and I'm like, I can pretty much predict where you guys are going to get burned out or stuck. So be aware of what that is. And then I think like obviously having people represented in those areas is really great. But if you can't do that, I actually think Working Genius, we didn't cover. I got a Master's of Divinity degree, and I was a pastor before I ever like joined.
I didn't know that about you. That's great.
Yeah, the way the Lord you constructed my journey to Table Group is beautiful and huge grace. But I remember thinking back and going like, man, we used to just like try to solicit volunteers. Like, can you help? Do you have a pulse? Like, can you do something? Like, and now with this lens, I would love to go, can I give you a job that matches your genius that is going to give you joy and energy? Are you an inventor? Like, I'd love to use your invention. We don't have that on our team. Is there somebody in the congregation that can help us think of how we should reorganize the children's ministry. You know, like
that's a great idea.
And people, when you give someone work that they love doing, it's a gift. And so much of this is about our ability to tap into the way God wired other people. And so, how do you build a team? Ideally, you'd have a great mixture of all of these things, and you'd go into every meeting and say, we're spending time in wonder and invention, and circle those things. Like, if you have tenacity, this might be frustrating for you. All of that is true. But if you're in a church setting where that's not possible, so many of those people sitting around wanting to contribute, if you give them the gift of contributing in their unique identity and how God wired them, they're going to jump at that opportunity.
Yeah, there are so many things that Working Genius explains. I worked with one ministry team, and the lead pastor was wonder and tenacity. So I don't know how rare that is, but it felt rare.
One of the rare ones, for sure.
He had a creative arts team, and it was so funny. It was just a few weeks before Easter, and he came into their planning meeting and said, I wonder if we're doing the right thing for Easter. I mean, they were full on in tenacity, and he wondered them. So we just had some, again, what's it called in the plane? Turbulence. And going through Working Genius, he just laughed. He's like, that's what I did. Yep. I brought him from tenacity back to wonder. And it was so helpful for their team. Because again, what are your frustrations? What's not going well? What's causing that burnout? It provides a lot of insight.
Yeah.
Cody, so we're going to wrap up our conversation, but I wonder if you just leave our listeners with one kind of practical exercise or conversation, maybe a prompt for them to help them name their wiring, and then to start to make adjustments to what they do, what their schedule looks like, what their meetings look like accordingly.
Well, I mean, and this is not we don't do sale. We have nobody on our team that does sales, but like, take the Working Genius. It's $25. It takes 10 minutes. It's super easy.
Yeah.
But then the other, we haven't like put a one sheet together around this exercise, but I often tell people to do this, which is just write down what you do in a given day, and then try to attribute it to what genius does that correspond to. And if 60-70% of that is outside of your working genius, like, let's have a conversation about how we could reorganize our role to put more of your time and energy into the thing that gives you life, And I mean, that's the beautiful part, is one man's trash is another man's treasure. If you're working in tenacity and that's not your gift, there's probably somebody on your team that would be like, boy, I'd love to do more of that.
Yeah.
So it's just the idea of like kind of getting more aware about what am I doing on a given day. And then also, for pastors, like I actually, looking back, my co-pastor was this beautiful like shepherd personality. And I'm sure he was a discerner enabler. He just like was so insightful and wanted to come along people and really cared about them. And I'm a galvanizer, and I loved being in front of people and trying to rally people around that. If I wanted to be like him, I think this is like the body of Christ part of it, which
isn't it?
The eye doesn't say to the foot, like, I don't need you, And so be who you are, like, just live into the identity the Lord gave you, the giftings the Lord gave you, and don't try to like work outside of that. Like, he made us to need each other for a reason. So
yeah, that's very good. Cody, so if listeners want to take the Working Genius assessment, or they want to find you, the podcast, how can they do all of that?
Yeah, sure. So workinggenius.com will have like the easiest like access to the assessment. We do a podcast, I think every other week. It's called the 6 Types of Working, or the Working Genius podcast with Patrick Lencioni. I'm not in the title, but I'll be on there if you listen to it. Yeah, it's fun. And if you start with the Working Genius podcast, we're now 3 years into that podcast, go back to the beginning, because we're talking about like sort of fringe applications to this. But at the beginning, it was like joy and energy. What job should I have? How do I organize my team? What do meetings look like? So don't start at the most recent one. It's like evergreen content. Go all the way back and start there.
I'll add one thing that I don't think we said. You said we don't need any more assessments in the world. And what I love about the Working Genius is that it's maybe 20% personality, 80% productivity. And that's what fits in this series that we've been talking about with Burnout. Is we want to be productive people, and we're going to be so much more productive and full of energy if we're living in our geniuses. So,
Cody, thanks for your time. This has been great. Well, Amy, I don't know about you, but I got some personal coaching through that conversation. It was really helpful for me to hear Cody go a little more in depth on the working genius side. What stood out to you from the conversation?
Well, I would just say if you're familiar with Working Genius, you probably tracked the whole 30 minutes with us today. If it's a new tool to you, we're not selling anything. We just at Unstuck, it was such a helpful assessment for us, and it really made us enjoy our work more. And so if you've got some feelings of burnout, dissatisfaction, I just think it's a really easy, simple, affordable tool to work through. I think it's going to answer some of the questions and give you some of the ahas that a lot of teams we've worked with. Burnout can mask itself in so many different ways. And this could be the area that's causing your frustration.
Yeah, absolutely. And, burnout, going back to part of what Cody talked about, and if you're working outside of your genius and just feeling that tension of every day doing things that don't bring you life and don't bring you joy, of course, a lot of the solution for that, especially for church teams, goes back to how they're structured, right? That's one of the things that we do as we get on site with churches. We help them build out organizational structure. That we talk about this all the time, Amy, and you do such a good job at this, getting the right people in the right roles. Not just for the church's sake, but also for those people's sake, so that they can serve in the way that God's really wired them for.
Yeah. And then, next week, listeners, it's our last week in this series, and we're going to have Lance Witt join us. I think when we talked about burnout early in the series, people were probably thinking about the things that we're actually going to be talking about next week. And that's going to be, how do we actually personally care for our soul? And have awareness when the other kind of burnout, not the structure one, not the wiring ones, but just general burnout start to sneak in. So please join us for that conversation.
Yeah. Well, listeners, thanks for being with us for this week's episode. And again, if this conversation's hitting close to home for you, or any of the conversations in this series, we would love to help. You can start a conversation with us just by going to theunstuckgroup.com, and make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen so that you don't miss the rest of the series. The next 2 episodes are going to be just as good as this one. We'll be back next week with a conversation with our good friend, Lance Witt. Until then, have a great week.